And we're recording.
Of course, and I'm just about to take a sip of my tea. You'll notice I have a really big one. It's about the size of my head. So that's why we know we're going to take a break later because, bladders. So there we are. Yeah, thank you, Lola, for inviting me out. My name is Krista Osborne. I work at MacEwan University for sure as a sessional instructor. I also do some teaching at the University of Calgary as well there, and I have a clinical practice. We're going to talk a little bit about me later. But one of the first things I want to do is just recognize what Lola said, is that all of us have been doing a lot of work. And I don't know about you, but it certainly increased my workload by a lot, which was already big. And so I imagine that that's fairly true for all of you. I know, just generally speaking, most of you are helpers in one way or another, and I know that you may be helpers in different ways than I am. And so some of this presentation will be um, applicable for sure to all of us, but you'll notice that some of the stories are coming from my sort of experience. And so keep that in mind and feel free to share some of yours. Like Lola said, I'm totally okay with you barging in and interrupting and asking a question if you need. If that becomes like we're going to run out of time, I'll make sure that we can push that to later. But I do like some interaction for sure. I'm just going to share my screen and we're going to go through the PowerPoint. So hopefully you can all see that. All right, I just need to get the chat up here. Of course, we had it all set up and then we didn't. Okay. And so this is mental health for helpers during COVID. And so one of the other things I wanted to acknowledge is that I am no expert in this by any stretch, and mostly because who could be? This is definitely something that is new. I hate the word unprecedented because I feel like we hear that a lot when it comes to this sort of experience. But it is definitely something that is very different. And so if you have any questions or you feel like you want to share a story, of course, feel free to raise your hand and then I'll call on you. The other thing is to keep in mind that there are like emotion things that you can use that are on the bottom of your screen. And so if you're finding that you really like something in particular, or you want to just sort of give me a thumbs up, that's okay too. Or of course, if my video conks out or my audio conks out, make sure you're putting it in the chat to recognize or to let me know. Okay. All right, let's get to her. First of all, sip of tea. You'll notice one of my self-care activities is always to have something warm to drink with me, which is kind of awesome. Okay. So one of the things that I have really kind of been drawn to in the last couple of years after doing some reading around the TRC and the Truth and Reconciliation Committee is recognizing that there's many things that I could be doing better in terms of acknowledging who I am and where I come from. And so one of the first things that is important for me to do, and part of my practice, is to always acknowledge where I'm at. And so I like to acknowledge that I am on Treaty 6 territory. I know many of you share that location, given where Drayton Valley is, but I also know that there's probably people on other treaty territories as well. So I just want me to take you a minute to think and be thankful for that experience, right? That our Indigenous folks, friends and neighbors were here, and we need to respect the history, language, the ceremony of all of those people and recognize that Treaty 6 territory is an area where people have really traditionally come together. And so it is an honor to be on this land, and it is certainly an honor to take place in something like this and to provide information to you. And so I'm hoping that within the context of the kind of work we do, that we're always very respectful of where we're at, because one of the things that's really important to know that you all probably experience daily in your work life is that minority groups and people who are in vulnerable sectors are definitely experiencing this COVID thing in a broader sense than many of more mainstream society is. And so we will talk more about that too. And so you can't talk about things without talking about where we come from and where we are. So, speaking of that, one of the other things that I've been taught in my work is that grounding myself in terms of who I am and where I'm coming from is very important because that gives you the opportunity to recognize my perspective and where do I come from, right? And so, first, I want to introduce you to my family of origin. That is the lovely people in bell bottoms on the right of your screen. That is my mom and me in that little pink dress, and my father and my two brothers. Although I think it's funny that we all have the same haircut. um, my mother and I, my mother was named Donna Wright, and my dad was Frank Wright. We came from Ontario when I was 3, so just a little bit older than this photograph. And so, and I come from like 5th and 6th generation um, Canadian. So we very much come from a family of settlers. So that's part of the perspective of which I was raised. The other part of my life, of course, is on the left side of the screen, and that is my family now. So there is my daughter and my son and my husband. So this is a picture of us in Cape Town a couple years ago. The reason I bring up this slide in particular is because we really struggled about whether or not we were going to go and do this trip with our family a few years ago because, it's expensive and we didn't have a lot of cash, but we always had the dream vacation. And so I'm really grateful that we took it when we did, because who knows if we'll be able to do a trip like that ever again, or at least in the next little while. And so these are important parts of my life. And as part of it, you're going to hear about the parts of these people when we talk about how do we as professionals manage in terms of the COVID time. And it's partly because you can't separate the personal and professional in a time like this. They kind of go back and forth. I see that there is a comment about whether or not I'll share my slides. Yep, totally on board, except for there's one slide you're going to see in a little bit. I'm hoping you don't post to social media because it's pretty embarrassing, but we'll get there. So that's me personally, but who am I professionally? I work in private practice as a therapist in St. Albert. And so I have a therapy office, of which I have not spent a lot of time in the last year. It's a beautiful space, but I spend most of my time, as many of you do probably, curled up in my bedroom in a little corner. I'm doing my work from there. So I do some face-to-face sessions with people in particular need, but I generally am doing my work from home. Yeah, I work with trauma, grief, and mental health. I also work a lot with adolescents, especially in the last little while, because what I find is people aren't necessarily looking out for their own mental health unless there's a crisis going on, but they are really working or looking towards getting help for their teenagers. And so as this pandemic goes on, I'm finding more and more stress-related mental health issues. So sometimes people who have come to me in the past are showing up again in my practice, and definitely our teens are finding this to be quite long and drawn out, as am I. So I do that. I do clinical supervision as well. I do take on new clients here and there for sure. And I am right now, but well, we can talk about that later. I am a sessional instructor with MacEwan and the University of Calgary, and I teach in the area of social work practice. So I've been teaching for about 12 years, and I've been doing private practice for not quite that long, but other things. So I do have a background of work in the hospital. I worked in a psychiatric unit with adolescents for a while. I've worked at different community agencies, and mostly around the idea of suicide prevention and intervention in crisis work. So that's a little bit of my background. You'll see it's very specific and quite clinical, but I like to do a lot of fun things. So one of the things that I like to do for fun is sort of try to figure out how to look at things from a more narrative perspective. And so in the middle of this pandemic, I went and did a course on grief and loss, because that's one of my areas that I do my most work. It's around trauma and grief and loss. And so I did a workshop. And Robert Niemeyer, he works with the Portland Institute, did this lovely workshop on writing through grief. And one of the things he did was this exercise on chapters. So I'm kind of adapting it for this presentation a little bit quickly, but I wanted to share with you a little bit of the chapters of my pandemic. So what kind of things happened and what was the process of what happened here? So first of all, the chapters of the pandemic When it came to, say, about March 12th, I was actually in a workshop with Robert Niemeyer then at the Fantasyland Hotel. For those of you that may have had the luck to be there, on the very first day, it was very weird because everyone's, it was on the 12th and 13th of March. And everyone's, sanitized. We're all sort of a little bit eerie about being in this big room full of everything all together. And then the next day, I was quarantined because I had been in a room with somebody else. So I didn't get to finish that workshop, which was really awful. And then school shut down. And so, really, the first chapter is what the right? Everything kind of, great, Jackie. I'm glad to hear you were there too. Yeah, so everything kind of fell out from under us very quickly. And I can tell you it was my daughter's 15th birthday last year on the day that they shut down school. So I think there was a little bit of panic. Now, from my perspective, as well as anyone who is, I think, paying a little bit of attention, we saw it coming slowly, but I don't think any of us realized quite where we were at. So chapter 2, this is the one I want you to see. And please, yeah, this is embarrassing. So you all have to realize how incredibly privileged you are to watch this.
This is going to be a very embarrassing, but I was inspired. So.
So that was my very futile attempt at trying to help start getting work back together. And so one of the things I did when after sort of the shook off is I had students that I was working with, and so yeah, I'm glad you're happy. That was really fun. And so I had students that were all in school to become social workers. Many of them which were just about to graduate, and then everything changed. And so what I did is a mental health boot camp for them. Right. And so every day I would post a video or a dance, or encouraging them to do the same thing, to start trying to, okay, I know I'm a mental health professional. How do I start helping support people? And I suspect that that's what a lot of you did, is that we just, after the shock wore off, we just sort of started to buckle down, right? Okay, what do I need to do? How do I need to take care of the people that we work with? And so for me, it was about doing silly dances in my pajamas and showing everybody my belly button, apparently. But it immediately and very quickly became about how do I take care of others, right? And so that's an easy focus for those of us who are helping professionals, because that's just where we innately go. And so that was the next chapter of my pandemic, is starting to really buckle down. How do I take care of my clients? How do I take care of my family? How do I take care of my students that I was working with? And so I got goofy. You should see I had a big tent, like a big tent fort for my mom, or for my daughter, on her birthday, because she wasn't allowed to see anyone. So we just used the whole living room and created a tent. And it was really fun. We had a lot of great time. The problem is when you start doing that kind of work, it's really hard to sustain it over a period of time. And so then what did I know? Well, I go back to my roots, right? And so those of you who have heard about Maslow will know a lot about what I mean about this is, okay, so we can't sustain this forever. We're going to be in it for a longer haul. So the next chapter for me was really about, okay, how do I do structure and routine? How do I create that structure and routine, not just for my family, but also for myself? So I started working out, started exercising, started making sure that we were all eating well, doing all those kind of basic needs. So if for those of you who don't know Maslow, basically the idea is that you work from the bottom up. So how do you take care of your physiological needs first? We have the most control over those. So then how do you work next to safety? And of course, that was a big issue in terms of the beginning of the pandemic, and of course still is now. But the reality is that we can't work all the way up to self-actualization in the middle of a crisis. And so often people want to look to that acceptance and feeling really good about themselves. But in the middle of chaos, we really have to go back down to some of those basics. And so where can we feel those things. And so that's what I did, right? Got my kids on a schedule, got my clients on a schedule. We talked about Maslow over and over and over again about how to get there. So structure and routine is really good. Great. I have to tell you, it didn't go well for ever. I think we handled that for a little while, but then certainly for me as a helping professional, one of the things that I started to recognize is how frazzled I was by these kind of Zoom calls. And so I'm expecting that many of you can relate to that, right? People in my life really wanted to connect because connection is so important in the middle of these things, but really at some point, it got really difficult to have the difference between work and life because so much was going on. Okay. And so, yeah, no, so I'd have friends would be like, do you want a video chat? And I'm like, oh, no, I've been talking to people all day via video chat. And that can be difficult. So even that structure and routine was, for me at least, I'm wondering if any of you can relate, was a little bit difficult to maintain. And so frazzled leads to chapter 4, the temper tantrum. This and most of the pictures that I have in this presentation are really connected to my family. So this is my daughter who just turned 16. She looks like an old man, but yeah, the temper tantrum. And so there was a few weeks probably a few months ago that I just was done. I was worn out and I was tired and I did not want to talk to anyone about their emotions ever again, right? I had friends, I had family members, I had clients that were all struggling, and I just found myself starting to struggle too. So what did we do? Had a temper tantrum, which is all good. And that leads to the chapters here, which is hope. And so this is where I want you all to like cheer for me. This morning, I got my mom her first vaccine dose. So we're very excited about her. So one of the things about this work-life balance, of course, is trying to find ways to protect not just our clients, but also the people in our lives that we're scared for, right? And so my mom lived on her own, or lives on her own, and she had to experience this pandemic very much alone, right? And so we opened up our house and said, you can come whenever you need, that you have access to us, as long as, of course, she was isolating herself from other people. So she's really experienced this just through my family, because she hasn't seen much of anybody else since all of this. And so we're very excited about getting her the vaccine, because then, she has been going out into the stores and doing stuff like many people, but yeah. So hope. As soon as I started seeing those needles go into arms, I was very excited, and I'm super excited this morning because getting my mom her first vaccine is awesome. So I'm hoping that we're starting to see a little bit of a light at the other side. For those of you who work with seniors, then yes, this can start to feel a sense of relief. But of course, we also need to know that we're not done yet, right? We've got a long way to go, and we have a lot of people to get those vaccines, including myself. And so I just heard that many of us that are regulated health professionals will be up shortly to get some vaccines. So that's really exciting for us, but we still have work to do in the meantime, and it's still going to be a while. So lather, rinse, repeat. I imagine that these chapters are just going to keep going in a cycle until we're on the other side. Okay, so what do I want you to do? I'm going to give you just a couple minutes while I'm talking to think about your own chapters of the book. So if your pandemic experience was a book, what would the chapters of the book be titled? I'm just going to give you a couple minutes while I drink my tea to think about that. I was going to get you into small groups, but we can't do that today. So we will talk about it as a larger group in a minute, if any of you have some really good ones. But I'm going to put my mic off, and I'm just going to let you guys think for a second. I kind of feel like I should do a dance while you guys are doing this, folks. All right, anyone brave enough to share? Andrea says shock, denial, anger, acceptance. Yeah, you know, it's interesting. When I was doing my chapters, I started with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and thought maybe that would have been a way to do it, but it just didn't fit for me. Chapter 1, confused and scared. Yeah, for sure. Chapter 1. Oh no, I'm at a new job. Oh dear, that would have been scary. How many masks and quilts can I sew? Yeah. What haven't I seen on Netflix? I'm tired of online courses. Those are great. Yeah. I also had thought of some chapters which were like started with like dazed and confused, but then when I was looking at them, I'm like, they're all drug related. That's not really the the way I wanted to go. Yeah. Great. So I'm going to keep going and I want you to keep sharing them in the chats. I think that's a great way to share with each other for sure. I'm going to be a really good cook. Yes. I'm still not a good cook, unfortunately. Okay. Go back to screen sharing. Okay. So that was adapted from Robert Niemeyer. He talks about doing chapters of our life in terms of grief and loss. To me, it's easy to connect that to the pandemic because that's really what we're going through is that grief experience. And so in the chat room, seeing people talk about, I've lost your chat again. Seeing people talk about that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is things that definitely makes a lot of sense to me because a lot of what we're experiencing is grief, and we'll talk more about that as the presentation goes on. All right, I wanted to connect. Now, this is a study. It came from CMHA, and it actually was done in May. They have a more updated one that has come out too that is saying more of the same. So what we're seeing is mental health becoming issues in terms of COVID for sure, right? So 38%, I don't know, you're in my chat button there. Oh yeah, 38% say their mental health has declined. This was back in, I think it was April or May of last year. 46% are feeling worried, 14% having trouble coping, 6% having suicidal thoughts, and then 2% having expressing harm to themselves, right? We also know that there's been an increase in terms of issues around domestic violence, right? Especially the severity of the calls. We do also know that there's been an increase of overdoses as in terms of issues around opioid overdoses, right? So that's another issue. Interestingly, the suicide rate hasn't gone up, but I have a feeling that that might be something that'll be a delayed response. Way back from my work in suicide prevention, we used to talk about during a crisis or even in third world countries, the suicide rates are often lower. And I believe that probably has a lot to do with that grit and bear it. When you're working on a lower level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, then sometimes people, I hate to say luxury because that's not quite the right word, but they don't have time to think about that existential kind of crisis. They end up being more focused on how do I survive. Yep, definitely higher uses of different kinds of substances included alcohol abuse, right? And so what does this mean for us as helpers? Well, depending on the kind of helping professional you are, it's going to mean something different for each of you. For those of us in the mental health world, of course, that this is going to be mean added strain on the people we work with. And sorry, I was just looking at Emily's chapters and I was laughing in my head. That's when I get distracted by the chat. It's great. But yeah, the mental health of the people that we're working with is struggling. But what we also got to remember is that we are also workers. We are workers and helpers, but we are also people too. So these numbers also include us, right? The other thing to keep in mind is that that not everybody is affected equally. And so there are different populations, and some of the sectors that most helping professionals work with are going to be disproportionately affected. So when we look at suicidal thoughts, for instance, and this is the matrix that the CMHA had used, when we look at who's affected, what you start to see is that people in low income are struggling more, people who are Indigenous are struggling more, and that people who already had mental health concerns are struggling more. And so what that means is those of us who are in those fields are going to have even more need. Then it affects people in the vulnerable sectors a lot more than it does other people. And so there are updated stats on this too that talks about the trend more now. They did this study again about 6 months later, and they were finding that, yep. And Jackie makes the point of people who are feeling really isolated. And of course they're feeling really isolated because we have cut off a lot of social supports. And so people who would have normally used different kinds of coping strategies are often using coping strategies that may be have more negative consequences too, right? And so if you can't get out of your house, for instance, around family violence, then that stress and strain on your relationship is going to be more dramatic. If you can't get out and talk to your therapist, then you may have used different kind of coping strategies that escalate things in different ways. So we could spend hours talking about different stats and about what's happening out there, but we all know if we're working in these fields that it's not good. And so one of the things I wanted to do then is to make sure that we're looking at things from a trauma-informed lens right from the beginning. And so that asks the question, not what happened, or asks the question, what happened to you instead of what's wrong with you. And so one of the things to keep in mind then is if we look at this from a trauma-informed lens, and I know some of you were at my colleague Faye Hamilton's speech around trauma-informed practice later, so you'll hear some of the similar things from me. But what we need to do is focus on what's going on, what's happening to us, instead of focusing on what's wrong with people. And so what is happening to us? Well, what's happening to us is everyone collectively as a society, not just on a micro level, but on a macro level, are changing. Our whole views of the way the world is changing. And so for those of you who are around for 9/11 will know exactly what I mean, because there's always a before and after when it comes to things that are traumatic. And so people will know, just like we did when we talk about where I did when I talked about my first chapter. I knew exactly where I was when it happened, when it became a reality for us. Most of us have those kinds of stories. And so that's where the change happens. And then there tends to be a before and after. Right? What's interesting now is we don't know what the rest of this is going to look like. So trauma changes our perception of reality. The lens which we see the world becomes different. So therefore our perception of self becomes different too. So we see ourselves in different ways. Our ability to get needs met in our relationship change as well. And especially when you put that in the context of a pandemic, we can't reach out to the people that we would normally. We can't do those things. And so many of us as helpers feel overwhelmed. And responsible for taking care of people that we can. So what ways do our worldviews change? Well, they change in some dramatic ways, right? So this is the work of Janice Belmden. You'll also hear it through, for those of you who are theory nerds, Bowlby talks about like attachment patterns, very similar kind of conversations, or I can't remember what he calls them. You may hear my dishwasher going in the background too. Anyway, what we're talking about is this idea of how we construct reality. And so in a perfect world where everything is going really well, we construct our reality under a certain lens, right? And so when we're born, if everything is squeaky clean and everything and we're supported in ways that are really important, then we're going to come up with these basic human beliefs about the world. I am trustworthy. The world is meaningful, and the world is benevolent. So I have agency. The world, there's a reason why I'm here, and the world is safe. And the reality is when trauma hits, so for people who have never had any experience of trauma, it can be pretty dramatic when these beliefs get changed. Now, keep in mind, I'm talking about the ideal world where an ideal person comes into the world with happy, healthy, supportive parents. They're well supported financially, that everything is going okay. But the reality is most of us don't come from that kind of background. And so keep in mind, I'm talking about an ideal, and we'll get to some of the more complications later. But even if your life is all pretty strong and supported, then trauma will change this perspective. And there's multiple ways that this trauma, or that our perceptions can change. So in some ways, what we do is get unhealthy adjustments, right? So people start reframing that idea that I'm strong, I am capable, into this idea that I'm weak and I can't, right? I'm not capable of doing this. The world is scary and dangerous. And certainly in a pandemic, if you felt like the world was really out there to support you, that the good things happen to good people, then you can imagine that having this kind of danger that's lurking in the corners can change the way you see the world on a very foundational level. And then this idea that the world is meaningless can come up. And so not all of these changes happen. Sometimes they just get, you start to see cracks in foundations. The foundation of a person's assumptive world can change dramatically and become rigid or unbalanced. And so those are the ways that sometimes our perceptions change. Now, if we make healthy adjustments, what we do is, instead of changing the whole foundation of who we are and what we believe in the world, we start actually making other adjustments to make it make sense. So healthy adjustments to a person's assumptive world need to be made to reinforce old ideas and beliefs, need to be altered to maintain the structural integrity of a person. And so trauma can really shake a person at their core. Who am I? And so what do we do if we're healthy? Well, I'm trustworthy. I'm doing my best. Sometimes I screw up, right? I can keep myself safe. I will do my best, right? The world is meaningful, but sometimes it's hard for me to understand the meaning. So what you can see is that when people start making healthy adjustments, it's not that they change the whole belief. They just sort of put an and or a but, right? The world is benevolent, but sometimes I need to protect myself. And those are how we can make healthy adjustments. That's what we talk about in terms of resiliency. And that's what we talk about in terms of post-traumatic growth, right? If things go well, then these are the kinds of adjustments that a person can make. But things don't always go well, right? So you can go one way or you can go the other. And how do you make that happen? The reality is, though, that this also happens on a professional level, right? If we were feeling like things were going really well, if we felt like things were going well in our career, then this can really shake that foundation of that too. And so some of us who are feeling really good at our jobs may be feeling less competent right now. And how do we make adjustments to who we are as professionals in order to make things feel stronger, right? How do we get that post-traumatic growth? Okay, so how do we do that? Well, there's lots of questions around that. What I want to do is, first of all, talk about loss, right? Recognizing loss is really important. Yes, you are grieving, and that's part of what's happening. Our clients are grieving, the people we work with are grieving, our family is grieving, our children are grieving, and you are grieving too. So I'm just going to take a second to sort of ask you, how are things going? Like, am I going too fast? Am I going too slow? Are we working out? Is this making sense?
It's making sense. And the pace that you're going at is really good.
Excellent. Anyone else?
Yeah, I think it's good. People are saying in the chat, the pace is good. Great so far.
See, this is my desire to like see faces smiling and nodding at me. So thanks for putting up with me on that one. Good, you're good. So what do we need to know? If I'm going to frame this if I'm going to frame a pandemic as a loss, then what do we need to know about loss? Well, there's lots, but we're going to condense it down for you because I only have an hour and a half left with you. Loss is not just about death, right? First of all, I want to recognize that some of us have lost clients. We have lost loved ones. We have lost jobs even in the middle of all of this. And so loss is not just about death, and you can definitely grieve any different kinds of loss for sure. And so I want you to keep that in mind. And in fact, with any loss, there's what I call collateral damage, right? So it's the loss itself is one thing, but there's often secondary losses that happen as well. And those sometimes can be even more difficult. I lost a very good friend of mine in the middle of this pandemic. He was a member of my wedding party, and he died of cancer this year, just a couple of months ago. And so for me, it's not just about death, but it's really about, like, grieving is different, right? We're not able to come together and have a service for him. And so that to me is a real loss in itself, right? Not being able to honor him in the way that I would like to, or with his family, is difficult. And I know that people have loved ones that have been in the hospital that they haven't been able to see, all of those things. So not just about loss of the pandemic itself, but the actual ritual of loss around death is also changed pretty dramatically. And that has an impact on all of us, right? For some of you, and I've worked with some people that work in like in seniors care. And so for some of them, they haven't really had the chance to, they really haven't had the chance to say goodbye to their clients the way that they would have, or the families be the way they would have in the past. And so the loss is also kind of snowballs on itself, in that that even as professionals, we can't say goodbye to the clients the way we would want to. Some of us were working very directly and intimately with some people, and then those were cut right off, right? I hear from schools pretty regularly, teachers talking to me about how they were really working really well with some kid. And then when the pandemic happened, they lost contact, right? And so that can be really difficult as well, in terms of how do we find closure as professionals. And that has a wear and tear on us, right? And so I want you to think about how your clients would grieve and recognize you do all that same thing, but there's also a different layer too. Yeah, my older grandchildren are hating school right now. Yeah, my kids kind of come and go with it, that's for sure. And so Christina says, when the changes of last March came, I was grieving the work that I was doing in elementary classrooms. Yeah, redeployment helped me find purpose in new work. And yeah, thank you for that comment, because I'm talking about the negative stuff here, that the things that are hard, but their losses are also different. They're complicated, right? Even positive changes can bring loss. Loss isn't always a negative experience. There's lots of things that are happening here. So loss happens with any change, positive ones or difficult ones. And so recognizing that even positive experiences can become difficult. Like one of the positives that I've experienced, and I'm sure many of you have as well, is my 16-year-old is here most of the time. And most 16-year-olds are starting to find their way in the world. And so we've got to spend time as a family that we might not have been able to. Yeah, not being able to go to school. Yeah, I feel bad for those grade 12 kids from last year, because not only did their grade 12 year end up getting demolished, but so did their first year of university. And so there's lots of things around post-secondary school too. And the teachers, right? Me not being able to see my students right in front of me is kind of difficult. Trauma exposure creates loss too, identity, competency, worldviews. And so I think that it's not a surprise that Black Lives Matter happened in the middle of all this. I am not surprised that we had a riot, or they had a riot in the States, or a siege on the election, those kinds of things, because what happens is when intensity and emotions come up, then so do people's perceptions of the reality, right? They become more acutely aware of some of the things that's happening. And so issues of identity and worldviews certainly tend to become more extreme. Framing traumatic reactions as grief can help make sense of people's emotional experience. And I think, in some ways, we're actually talking more about mental health than we have been in the past. And I think that can be really helpful, so that when I talk about grief now, like people grieving, compared to say at the beginning of this, I think people are being much more sensitive. So what if this is a grief, then what do we know about grief? Well, grief is an interesting one, because we've always wanted to make stages of grief. Our mainstream Western culture is really good about trying to categorize and make sense of things. And so we like to label it, right? And so Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was a brilliant woman, made stages of grief, or of dying, really, and came up with these themes that we talk about pretty regularly in the world. I have to tell you, though, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is not, while I think she was a brilliant theorist, I don't think that particular theory has done a lot of good in the world in terms of grief, because there's this expectation that there's a process, there's a way to work through your grief, when the reality is grief is messy. And so what we need to know is that sometimes, like my one chapter, sometimes we're going to have temper tantrums. Sometimes emotions are going to be high, and that's okay, and that's normal. And so if you're struggling with your own mental health, even as a helping professional, it's okay and it's normal. And it doesn't mean you're bad at your job. Okay, so what are the theories I like around grief and loss that I think can be helpful in this perspective? Well, back to Niemeyer, you can tell me, you can tell that I like this guy and his theories, which is why I was so sad when I couldn't see his whole presentation last March. Basically, the idea of meaning making, this idea of how do we find meaning in loss, that is really the root of what grieving can be about, right? And really, when we talk about it, it's also the idea of how do we make sense of what's going on around us, right? And so how do we make meaning in not just loss, but also in life, and keep thinking about it from that perspective. So how do we make meaning out of a loss? Well, there's three kind of themes that we talk about, because keep in mind, there's no way to work through it. We all have to kind of live with it, just like any loss. We don't get over it. There's no end game. But what are the kinds of things that we're looking for in terms of making it make more sense? Well, sense making is one of those things. So how do I make sense of what's happened? This is where people, when they're grieving, tell the same story over and over and over and over again, right? That's why we all like to tell the story about when COVID lockdown happened, right? Or when did the second lockdown happen? It's because it's our brain really trying to process something that's really difficult. We have no map in our head about how to manage this. And so we're constantly trying to make sense of what's happening around us. And so for many people, of course, that can be a religious experience. They go to make sense of it by looking to a higher power. Some people don't. They look to make sense of it within a family context. It doesn't matter. What we want to do is find a way to help people understand that they need to try to make sense of it until that question is no longer important, right? If you can't make sense of it, sometimes we got to let things go. But the question of why over and over again is okay, right? That's part of grieving. Benefit finding. This is an interesting one because finding meaning in a loss, regardless of what the loss is, a natural part of that is trying to find, Jackie's talking about some people make sense by finding someone to blame. Absolutely. Yeah, and that's a pretty normal thing in trauma exposure too, is that anger often comes from that. And so instead of looking inwardly, they often look outwardly, and sometimes for good reason. But it's difficult because in a pandemic, there's no one really to blame. Again, that sense-making piece, though, you can see why different political movements have shifted too, because we put trying to find some place to put that energy can be really positive, or can obviously create some dynamics that are more difficult. So benefit finding, again, how can we create and change and build new meaning structures? And that's where I think things like the Black Lives Matter movement have really tried to take this opportunity where privilege is so dramatically obvious. And how do we take that and actually use this as an opportunity to change and build a society that we actually are looking for, rather than one that we have used, or seeing the problems with the system that we already have. Anyway, so we look for finding benefit, right? And so when I said, hey, one of the things that has been positive for me is that I've got to spend time with my kids. That's part of the way I've processed this experience. And then, of course, the third one is really around identity change. Who are we now? Not just as individuals, but as a society. How can we have changed, or how have we changed because of this experience and this loss? And you can hear politicians at the beginning of this really, we're in this together, we're trying to do that kind of thing. And you can see how, as this continues on, that becomes harder and harder to hold on to that sense of camaraderie. Anyway, doing good. I was just wondering if you guys needed a break, but I think we're going to keep going for a little bit longer. Okay. So those are the kinds of things that I want you to think about, not just for yourself, but also for the people you work with too. How can we look at helping them find meaning, make sense, and figure out who they are now, right? This is where I want to transition a little bit into just talking about us as helpers and what are the unique issues in terms of that. And so I love this picture because so often us as professionals really end up becoming enmeshed with our clients, right? Part of the reason why we want to be helpers is not just we want to be helpful and we want to help people become better, but it also is because so much of our identity tends to be tied up in being a helper, right? It makes me feel good when I help other people. And that's not to say it's selfish. It's maybe a little bit. But it's a motivation that is healthy, really, because energy should always flow back and forth. You should be getting something back from what you're giving, because otherwise you're going to burn out. And so how do we find that balance and make sure that we're not just helping and running a marathon of helping people and then just making it a cost to ourselves? Because I'm sure some of us, and I know for myself for sure, there's been times, and there will probably continue to be times, that I give more than I get. And when that happens, I start to become resentful if I'm not careful. So we have to figure out how to manage that. So empathy and compassion are core skills and characteristics for helpers. All of you are here at this workshop because on some level that you are a helper. And so that my guess is all of you have some kind of empathy and compassion for humanity. That's what drives you to be the helpers that you are. However, being empathetic and compassionate are the very skills that put helping professionals at risk for the negative impacts of trauma exposure. And so what we need to know is that because we are who we are also at more at risk for suicide. We also are more at risk for mental health concerns, for burnout, right? Those kinds of things. And so we need to be looking out not just for our clients and the families we work with, but also for each other. And because somebody's struggling doesn't mean that they're not capable, it just means they're struggling. And so we need to look out for that. Helpers put themselves in harm's way by being in relationship with those who have experienced trauma. And so I often talk about dosage, right? Trauma is, my dog's going to want in a second. Trauma is interesting in that trauma exposure is about how much trauma do you get exposed to in a day. And so for most of us in our life, we have, traumas that happen periodic in our lives. But when we also do it in our work, one of the things to keep in mind is that you may not be directly in the story. And so that definitely helps with boundary. But when we hear stories of trauma over and over and over again, that can change the way we see the world too. And that can be difficult. And for those of you who are in supervisory roles, again, it might not be direct, but you probably hear more of those stories because you're up the chain. So you end up having more people directly report to you who you only end up hearing these negative stories that can become problematic over time. Okay, what else do I got? All right, other issues specific to helpers. One of the things that I feel like we need to recognize is precarious employment. So specifically, the timing of this pandemic became very difficult in that it also came at the same time as oil and gas industry sort of plummeted. It also came at a time where our provincial government was making cutbacks. And so many of us were already worried about our jobs. And because most helping professionals work in sectors that they are vulnerable to cuts, in the middle of all this, some of us have had difficulty in terms of employment. For helping professionals that are out there that are new and young, so for instance, my students when they were graduating, I felt bad for them because some of them, it could be very difficult in terms of finding work. Dana talks about we are also dealing with the increasing complexity of issues with our clients. Yeah, so multiple traumas on top of each other, especially in addiction and mental health. You're exactly right. So not only are you just dealing with other people's trauma like you normally would, but we're hearing about escalating trauma too. So we're under more complicated cases coming to us because some of the minor cases have actually gone underground, right? And so what we end up seeing is with more elevated issues. Privilege and guilt. This is one that I know I felt pretty acutely at different times, right? Especially when I'm working with my students who sometimes don't have a lot of money yet because they're out in the world, or some of my more low income people I work with, is that I had the luxury of working from home. Not everybody did. And so the idea of privilege being that I can keep my family safe in a way that some people can't. And that privilege is really harder to swallow in the middle of some of these things. And so I found myself at times having that issue around guilt, right? Of what does that mean? And how useful is that feeling in terms of the work that we do, right? Waterfall of need is definitely one of the issues. And so we're definitely dealing with more complex cases. We're definitely dealing with more acute issues, right? And having to manage them often with less money and in an inability sometimes to see people face to face. So it makes it really hard to do assessments of what's actually going on when you can't actually see a family in their home, or you can't even just see them face to face and in person. And online environments are much better than I thought they would be. I got to tell you, I was really reluctant to do therapy online, but it does work a lot better than I expected. But again, there's privilege attached to that, right? How is somebody's Wi-Fi, for instance, in terms of accessing resources? Can they see us this way, right? Is it safe to go into some of those places for us as well as for them? And that can be complicated. Also, of course, we are not people who are working in isolation. So many of us have had different experiences with our own families, right? So I shared that I am one of the primary caregivers for my mom, who is, an independent and senior, but still having to struggle with her mental health needs, as well as my own, as well as my children's, is complicated. One of the saddest things that I have ever experienced is going and seeing my husband's grandma on her birthday. It was her 98th birthday, and we had to watch this poor woman through a window because we thought that would be a good idea. And the reality was she just didn't understand why we wouldn't come in, and she was very upset. And so having those kind of personal experience as well as dealing with all of this stuff from our clients is really complicated for everyone. Trauma exposure, and I talked about that a little bit earlier, about how much and how often, right? And so we're experiencing more complicated traumas and more complicated stories and more often than normal. So, and with less coping skills and less resources. Are there others? If in the chat, anything that somebody has that they wanted to add? We were unable to see my dad in person for months at a time. Yeah, I haven't seen my grandmother, well, my husband's grandmother, since April, since her birthday. Yeah, so that's not good. Haven't seen your mom since November. Not allowed to visit each other or in our community. Yeah, and so you can really see how complicated it can be when your normal support systems or the things that are normal in your life are different. You have a curfew as well. Yeah, and every community is a bit different. Seems to pile up. Loss of sense of humor. Yeah. Oh, having families out of province. Yeah, I have a brother who lives in the States. He lives in Georgia. And so they were having some real big difficulties even around the election. And my brother, I don't think has left his house in a year, which is good because I'm feeling much safer about him there. But yeah, really difficult because my mom hasn't get to see her grandkids then. Stress following COVID, rules at work. Yeah, that's actually a really good point, right? There's this real tear in us in terms of what is safe for our families and what is safe for us. And then also trying to deal with these complicated rules, right? That can be difficult. This day we wear a mask. This day we were told not to wear masks, and now we're all wearing masks. Yeah, and that and not being able to people as they're dying. Yeah, I know I've worked with a lot of social workers that have worked in ICUs that get to sit there with people while they're dying because that's their job right now, is really to help because the families can't be there. So they're zooming in with families to do those kinds of things. Oh, and job roles totally changing. Yeah, that's actually a really good point, right? So some of us, some people in the helping professions get seconded, right? Like they just got everything pulled out from under them and were told they had to go do something else. Yeah, unable to see grandchildren. Yeah, those kinds of things are definitely issues around going, yeah, weddings, the other thing, positive changes, right? People not being able to do those kinds of things, making the choice about whether or not you want to break the rules and the implications of that, right? And how complicated that can be in terms of family dynamics. That's another one I didn't put up on there, right? If you're, how the way you see the rules and the way you see following the rules is different than, say, a family member. It can cause an awful lot of family dysfunction, right? Christmas, for instance. Some people got together still for Christmas, even though they weren't supposed to, and then other people getting left out. Yeah. Also for introverted people, yeah, I have to tell you, at first I was really surprised because so many of my clients deal with anxiety, and some of them, like that social anxiety, they felt really good for a while because they didn't have that pressure to go out. So yes, I think that's an excellent example that's in the chat around less expectations. That's good. Okay, so I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take 5 minutes to catch my breath. Keep putting these in the chat room for a minute. And then what I really want you to do is I'll stretch too. One of the things about self-care is not sitting for so long. So take 5 minutes. We'll come back at 2 o'clock. So that's not even 5 minutes. That's about 3 or 4 minutes. And then we will talk some more. If anybody has any questions while I'm sitting here for a minute, feel free to ask. Yeah, Jackie, I see what you're saying in the chat. It's interesting because my daughter, of course, is 16, and she's pretty good at listening to us, or hasn't had much of a choice in the matter. But so many of her friends and her friends' families just don't seem to care, right? So the kids are getting together, they're having sleepovers, they're doing all sorts of stuff, and it really has an impact on her in terms of having to feel different, right? So that can be difficult. So yeah, every family member has different things, and she's been really great, but she's getting a little tired of this, as we all are. Yeah, difficult if family members are not on the same page, for sure. I love how you guys are using the chat. it's great. I feel like I'm going to have to go through the chat at the end and make sure I caught up on all the conversation.
It's funny what Jackie said.
Yeah, no, I know. Goodbye. That is funny.
Yeah, I find the rules, I made the comment about the rules, I find them very stressful because they change. And it's
Yeah.
hard to keep up with what they are whenever, because our office is open and I have frontline staff providing services, lots of them are on the call today. So it's like keeping up with what the rules are today.
Yeah, and having to enforce rules too, right? Like that can, all of a sudden we went from helpers to being like security guards. That can be
Yeah.
Yeah, my daughter works in she got a job in the middle of all of this, of course, in a grocery store, because that seemed logical for her to do. Although she's an extroverted person, so it's been a nice way for her to still get out. But yeah, the number of people who yell at a 16-year-old because she asked them to wear a mask is just ridiculous to me. Because I get that you may not want to wear a mask. I might even get that you don't like the rules. I don't understand why you think the 16-year-old has anything to do with them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's terrible.
It is terrible.
And trying to convince people, like some people are just convinced that it's all a farce and it's exhausting. I don't know. It's just exhausting.
Yeah, and how do you keep yourself safe knowing if you're one of those people who are following the rules? It's really it's demoralizing when you see other people not, because we're trying so hard, and yet, we're not going to have any luck if people are just out there doing anything anyway, and that can be difficult. Desiree, I really like your comment about participating in workshops. Yep, absolutely. I think one of the benefits has been getting together in different ways, and certainly I think a lot of our rural folk have been able to get a lot more education opportunities than they would have in the past, and so that's definitely great. Of course, Wi-Fi is a little bit of an issue for some of those rural folks too, so that can be problematic. But yeah, I'm hoping.
Oh, sorry, that
Go
I
ahead.
was just going to say something. That's something that I've always noticed, but because I am rural and I work with individuals who, a lot of them do not have internet, and so really noticing that difference, and particularly in my role, what I do is I help job seekers connect to jobs, but my role has so much expanded since COVID because of all the other needs. But what before, being able to see someone or a group of people in person where they could come into a site, and now having to, perhaps with the individuals who don't have internet access, that's now 3 different phone calls. That takes much more time in that sense. So like some of the things in my job take 3 times as long now because of that.
Yeah, and that's more difficult, right? And the people who, like, I think of the school system too, right? The people who can manage are managing fine, right? The people, like, my kids are both good students. They're going to be fine, right? They miss a day here or there because they're isolated. They're okay. But I have a nephew who has pretty severe ADHD. And it was really difficult to get him to sit for long enough, right? So kids with special needs or issues in terms of learning, definitely more complicated. Seniors who are more at risk, right? Getting access to them. The people who need the access the most are the ones that often have the least ability to get connected. And I think we're going to have some long-term consequences of that, Desiree, because you're not going to have as much caseload that you're going to be able to work with because everything takes longer. And the most vulnerable people are the ones that are falling off the grid. The ones that are going to cope and have access to money and resources are the ones that are probably going to be okay. And so just again, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and the more vulnerable get more vulnerable, right?
Yeah, and that's definitely what I'm noticing, in the sense that, you know, my role is really to be connecting people to employment. But however, you know, it's those without the technology, or, you know, maybe even like a pay-as-you-go phone, so they can't call a centralized system because it uses minutes. Or, you know, my role has expanded now with my helping instincts, so that I'm helping to make those connections to the community services, to help someone, you know, get access to the food bank, because, or whatever it may be. So like, yeah. And what I'm noticing, it's those people, it's the more vulnerable that I see that are falling through the crack, even more so. And yeah, that's hard to witness sometimes. I find that really hard to wrap my head around that, and to maintain like a sense of like equanimity, not to be, you know, like just so discouraged, and to come from a place of, like I say, like balance. And yeah, that can be a struggle sometimes, and not to feel really angry that's happening.
Yeah, no, I hear you, right? Because some of the circles that I'm, friendly and like we're doing okay. Like we're doing okay there. We should just sit down, shut up, and enjoy our coffee on our in our backyards, right? Like it's okay. We can talk over the fence, right? But then there's so many different subsections, and I find it really difficult to relate to people sometimes when they don't have the same experience I do, right? And so because I work with vulnerable people, I get really frustrated when I hear somebody say something like we were talking about in the chat, right? The it's conspiracy theories, right? Like it's not real. We're not there. I'm like, yeah, talk to a healthcare worker, right? Because I may not be seeing it directly in my face, other than sort of indirectly through my clients. But the people who are sitting there in the hospitals, they know what is going on, right? And then the people who aren't, are not recognizing, and that can be really frustrating and demoralizing. And so, Desiree, I think that's an excellent point, and it actually brings me to the next slide. Look at that! Look at you helping me out. I love it. It just means we're all on track and on the same page. Is that is this idea of privilege and guilt, right? And so we end up in these situations where it's really complicated, right? That we have sometimes the guilt of not doing enough can be problematic for us as helpers. Sometimes the guilt of not doing or doing too much because we're taking away, right? Like there's some days when I'm working with clients over and over and over the course of the day, or I have students that are super anxious and have high needs, and I'm working with them, but to the detriment of my family, because my family is also struggling and going through this, and trying to balance about who needs me the most and where is it the most important is a real issue around professional guilt, right? So I have this slide really around guilt from a privilege point of view. So those of us who are doing well and okay in the world and have the color skin that I have, right? And what kind of privilege is that? How am I accountable to that? What does that mean? Because I'm doing all right, and because the world works in my favor in many ways, this has been hard on me. I can't even imagine on people who have other struggles that this is, right? And so professionally, I often feel like I struggle with that, right? Personally, of course, how do we struggle? And then this idea of how do we manage around survivors, right? How do we manage around people who've gone through this and changed? And so guilt is a big issue, and having to figure out how do we manage that kind of complications? How does it affect the way our personal relationships, right? Because sometimes I get really angry when I hear people not doing what we're supposed to be doing, because it really just, sometimes it doesn't affect them, but it will definitely affect others. Okay, so that was all the negative stuff. I'm ready to move on to something more positive. I hope you all are too, because there are some positive things that we can do in order to help us move in a positive direction. I've seen 7 people in my family have COVID. Yeah. You know, I actually heard a story the other day of a guy who had a birthday party, and it was totally within the realm at the time of that. And then 6 out of the 8 people at the party ended up with COVID. Nice, right? And it's just people trying to be, wanting to celebrate with each other, and how difficult that can be. And it's easy to make one exception, but sometimes, and we all probably have, right? I don't want to say that I've been an angel throughout all of this either, but how do we make exceptions, and how do we not, and how do we deal with that when things are going on? Yeah, I think conspiracy theories are very frustrating. This is what JJ's saying in the chat. Yeah, totally. I agree. And for those of us in helping professionals in the middle of all this, we definitely can see it differently, I think, than some. So what helps? Well, I put up this slide because we all know some of this stuff. It's just self-care is such an interesting concept. And I don't really love the concept of self-care, because that implies that if you're not healthy or you're struggling with your mental health, then you did something wrong. You didn't, right? But there are some things in the basics that we all know, but sometimes in the middle of chaos, it's hard to do. And so let's walk through some of them. So check in, what has helped you? I guess this is when I was wanting to check in with you all. I did it a couple slides earlier, but it may be in the chat while we keep going, that you can share some stuff about what has worked for you in terms of helping, and I'll keep that chat up. Okay, so I'm going to give you a counseling session very quickly. You are dealing with this experience the best way you know how. So I want you to keep that. I want you to hear it, because I'm going to say it again. You are dealing with this experience the best way you know how. And that's super important in terms of recognizing where we're at. Stop shitting on yourself. So when you're in a position of feeling like, oh, I should be doing one more thing, I should be doing something else, stop shitting on yourself. It's okay for you to just be for a little while. So I like that. Walking your dog, singing and dancing. Yeah, you saw me dance in the middle of the living room, so you can see. 10 minutes of meditation. Yeah, these are all great suggestions for sure. So stop shitting on yourself and stop shitting on others. If you like how you're coping, then, or if you don't like how you're coping, then change it. So, and that doesn't mean that it has to be big changes. In fact, little changes can be quite helpful, right? Making sure that you're doing little things. If you do like how you're dealing with it, then be proud. It's okay. Guilt isn't helpful. So it's okay to be helpful or to be happy with where you're at. Okay. And then forgive yourself of mistakes. So sometimes you're going to screw up, right? Just the other day, I had a student who wanted a reference letter from me for getting into post-secondary. And I've been juggling so many things. I missed the deadline. That's brutal, right? I feel bad. Good news, I was able to talk to the university, partly because I work there, and get some exceptions for her. But it's brutal. Like, we're going to make mistakes. You're going to drop balls, and that is totally okay. You just got to try to do the best thing you can. All right, and celebrate your victories. So what is going right? I want you to take time and celebrate. It's so easy for us to be like, okay, next one, and run on that hamster wheel. But I want you to take time and enjoy the things that you are doing right and when they work. And then forgive those around you, right? And that's the frustrating one, especially when we were talking about some of the conspiracy theories, right? We're doing our best to try to help minimize the damage to vulnerable people, and yet others aren't. And you got to remember, it's also because they're scared too. And they're not sure what to do. And even the anti-maskers, like I said, that would telling or that get annoyed with my daughter when she's at work. Yeah, you have to remember that even they're coming from a place of trauma. And so another thing helped me, developing a session for the Girl Guides called De-Stress. Yeah, that's what that's kind of similar to what my little dance was there, is trying to figure out ways to help others to that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the brain. I know some of you have probably done some work in terms of brain trauma informed practice, is talking about brain development and fight or flight responses a lot. So I'm going to go over it quickly because for those of you who are interested, you probably already know some of this. And for those of you who this doesn't relate to, I don't want to bore you too much with lots of details, but there are some important parts of how our brains work that really are helpful in terms of figuring out how to help ourselves. So this is a lovely little picture of your amygdala. I like to say it because I think it's a fancy word, but your amygdala is really, for those of you who've ever heard the fist metaphor, they call it the fist model of or the hand model of the brain. So what it is really that if you look at your brain, this is where your amygdala is, right in the middle, right? And so it's on the back of your head in this place right here. It's one of the first things that develops in terms of us as fetuses, but also evolutionarily. The amygdala is a very important part because if we didn't have amygdala, we wouldn't have stress or anxiety, but we also wouldn't know how to save our own lives. So what we need to do is have an amygdala or amygdala that is responsible for that fear response that can help us avoid danger. And so our amygdala really is like a fire alarm. It just sits there and scans for danger right in the background. So when we aren't even thinking about it, our amygdala is paying attention to things that happen around us. We know this because if you hear a loud sound, we all kind of move towards it or we look towards it. If your hand gets put on a hot stove, your amygdala is what is responsible for actually removing it before you even know what's going on. And so our amygdala is that fear response. The problem with our amygdala is it's actually rather dumb. It doesn't know about time and space. So it always responds to things that are happening now. So what's good about that is if your amygdala is reacting to something that's happening in the here and now, a lion walks in the room, your amygdala goes, oh no, there's a lion here. It dumps adrenaline and cortisol into your system so that you can run from the lion or that you can fight the lion if you want. Yes, and absolutely. The amygdala plays a huge role in emotional memory. And this is why. So your amygdala has a response, but it also gets tied into your hippocampus. I just love saying the word hippocampus because it sounds like there's a little hippo in my brain. And so where emotional regulation happens is in this place between memory and emotion. And so your amygdala is really responsible for so much of your emotion, but it gets tied into that memory center. So your amygdala itself doesn't know time and space. So that's why PTSD can happen, right? Is that your amygdala responds to fear, but that fear could have been something that happened, something that happened way in the past, right? So a shot or a loud sound and people think that all of a sudden they're back in a memory of like a war or something. I hear it a lot when people hear sirens, right? If they've been in an accident and then later in life they're walking through somewhere and then way almost beyond perception, they can hear like an ambulance, and so then they end up in this anxiety response. It's their amygdala that's scanning the room all the time for danger. Okay, so all of us have amygdalas. That's good. Some of them are more sensitive than others. So for those of us who struggle with anxiety, you probably just have a super sensitive amygdala, and that's not your fault. It's just the way you were built. And for those of us who've experienced a lot of trauma, our amygdalas become more sensitive over time. And so that means that we'll react quicker to stress than in the past. And so one of the things that we need to know is that from a brain chemistry point of view, from an actual, not just chemistry, but actual functional point of view, our brains are changing in the middle of this. So our amygdala is designed to scan the room for danger. It scans the room. If it sees something, it goes to the hippocampus and says, what do I do? Your hippocampus is where your memories come up. So it says, hey, last time there was a lion in the room, I ran up a tree. So then what happens is your brain is already responding before we even get to thinking. So that prefrontal cortex, that front part of your brain, isn't even activated yet. And so when we talk about a fight or flight response, like a lion coming in the room, what we need to know is that this part, this rational part of our brains, is actually not really in play. In fact, it turns off because we don't really need to think when there's a lion in the room. We need to react. Okay, where's the problem though, is that the hippocampus is our memory center. It accesses what we should do. But if you're in a novel situation, then it doesn't have a map. It doesn't know what to do. So add in a pandemic. Our amygdala senses fear. We hear it all around us. We're scared. We know that there's a danger out there, but our memory center doesn't have a map to tell us what to do. So we have to create this map. And that in itself is anxiety driven, because our front of our brain is not working as well as it would have if we had a plan, if we knew what the map was, right? And so keep that in mind. There's a lot more, and I'm giving you some very basics of it, but I just want you to know this fight or flight response is something that happens. It's also part of what we call your autonomic nervous system, and your amygdala and your emotional response. Why is that important? It's because you don't have control over it completely, right? It's just like your heartbeat. It's just like your breathing or your blinking. We do have some semblance of control, but these things will happen in the background, whether we're actively thinking about it or not. And so when we have a stress response, keep in mind you're not always in control. This part of your brain isn't always working. And so I think collectively as a society, part of the reason why we're getting to more extremes is that we're starting from that emotional place. We're already getting long-term low levels of stress. Okay, what does all this mean? What we're really needing to do is find balance, right? Our parasympathetic nervous system and our sympathetic nervous system are basically the answers to me in terms of therapy about everything. How do we get back to calm? Which is really what we mean by emotional regulation. So your parasympathetic nervous is that rest and digest. In extremes, this is where that freeze response happens. So for instance, if there was a lion that came into the room and you didn't have a map, you've never experienced a lion before, often what will happen is we'll see a fear response, right? A freeze. Somebody will go, oh, I don't know what to do. And then our bodies shut down. That's the freeze response, right? The fight or flight response is our sympathetic nervous system is responsible for that. That's that activated response. How do I get the energy to get out of here, right? Our bodies are always looking between these two extremes. I'm happy, I'm excited, I'm just want to sit down and watch Netflix, those kind of things, right? And so we're always looking for that emotional regulation between. So to me, happiness is not really the goal of life. Actually, calm and regulated is the goal, because happy is an activated response. It's your sympathetic nervous system. And that's great, but you also want an equal amount of calm. Okay, so here's the answer to what do we do about all this, is that we have to pay particular attention to our nervous systems. And this is important because it'll help us figure out what's going on, but it'll help us help regulate the people we work with as well. Anyway, I hope I got that to you. So what is a panic attack? Well, it's a highly activated nervous system. What is depression? Well, it's an underactivated nervous system. And so what we need to do is try to find a way to get a little bit balance between activation and calm. And so there we go. Now we were talking about introverts in the chat earlier. Introverts are usually people who just need more rest and digest. They need less stimulation than others in order to feel that sense of calm. Totally all good. But you can see how people who regulate those emotions in different ways can have difficulty in different times. Okay, so how do you regulate a dysregulated system? Because some people tend to go to anxiety, some people tend to go to depression, some people swing, right? I gotta do, and then I'm done, right? So some people swing in terms of that place. But what we really want is calm, gentle kind of movement between those systems. So when a system is really dysregulated, what you'll notice is that people are highly emotional. I like to think of it as the nervous system's response to like a temper tantrum, right? When your nervous system is off, you're really reactive to a situation. And that's not always sometimes that's because you're in a fight or flee response. So if I go back to that hand model, right, your amygdala is under here. What we often talk to about kids is that that when they're stressed or when they're overwhelmed or when they're panicking, that we flip their lid. And so it's like that emotional center is highly exposed. And what I'm telling you is that most of us our lids might not be totally flipped, but they're definitely our amygdala is more exposed to stress than it would normally be. So how do we regulate a dysregulated system? Well, connection for one. The reason why that's really important is our amygdala might be part of us before we're even born, but emotional regulation is learned. It is not innate. So how do we learn how to regulate our emotions? Well, that's generally through our parents or our caregivers or adults in our lives that help nurture our emotional state. So when a baby is crying, we, as a caregiver, we innately pick them up. And that's because connection is important. People learn how to regulate their emotion through connection. And so if somebody in your life is feeling very disconnected, the best thing you can do, or they're having a panic attack, is to reassure, calm, or support and remain calm. The reason why remaining calm is really important is because the way you can regulate another individual is by regulating yourself. So if you see somebody panicking, us as helpers all have skills to be able to stay calm. And that calmness is going to help teach them how to regulate themselves. Make sense? Complicated. And so what that means for you as a helper, if you're finding that your system is dysregulated, just hanging around people who are calm can be very helpful, right? If you're in the middle of a panic attack or a panic response because you're getting all that adrenaline and cortisol in your system, one thing I didn't say earlier that I think is important is that cortisol and adrenaline, when your amygdala drops it into your system, at that point you don't have any control. Once the cortisol and adrenaline is out and in your system, all you have to do is ride the wave. And it's an emotional reaction, right? So often people will fidget, or they'll pace, or they'll breathe heavy, or they'll get red and sweaty. Those kinds of physiological responses to stress, once they're there, all you can do is wait until your body your liver and your kidneys are able to process those. So just keeping a person calm, allowing that emotional release to happen because it's totally okay. And then, of course, addressing safety issues, dealing with ongoing threats. The things that we got to keep in mind is that our amygdala is dumb. It doesn't recognize the difference between a lion and an emotional threat, right? It's the same thing. And so people are responding like they're going to die sometimes when clearly they're not. And this part of it's because the front part of their brain isn't working properly. For dog owners, think about what happens to anxious dogs when a human is wound up. Totally. I think it's really funny. I learned that lesson because I have a totally anxious dog. And one day I was sitting with a dog trainer and they said to me, well, you're going to need to keep yourself calm. And I had this like aha kind of moment because it was earlier on in my career, but this aha moment because that's exactly what I talk to about parents with kids with anxiety. And I'm like, here I am, the parent of my dog, and having the dog trainer talk to me about staying calm. Yeah, horses too. That's why animal therapy is awesome, because animals are better at reading our systems than sometimes we are, right? And so I also tell my clients regularly to watch their cats if you're a cat person, because cats, from my point of view, come in two different personalities. Ones that are like therapy cats. So if they sense a stress system, they'll come in and cuddle and purr, or the ones that hide they run for the corners. And so some of those cats that if they see a stressed person, they'll be like, I'm not doing anything with you, and then run away. So know your cat. And then if you can't read your own emotions, see where your cat is. then you can tell how you're feeling. Okay, so dealing with ongoing threats is important. And then of course, addressing the stress hormones. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. Okay, what can we do when we're not okay? Now, this is the stuff that I really think is really so obvious, like drink water, eat good food, breathe, those kind of things. But they're often the things we totally do not do when we're stressed out. And remember, it's because this part of your brain is not working properly. And so it might be clear to everybody around you what you need is some sleep and some exercise and some good food, but you're too busy freaking out to recognize that going back to the basics, going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, is probably the best thing you can do for yourself. And so sometimes that means helping others do that, right? So if you have a family member who is struggling, take them for a walk, right? How do you cook them a nice meal? Those kinds of things can be really helpful. So, but it's also why I don't like the word self-care, because we just assume that people are, when you hear people talk about it, it's like, yeah, okay, glass of wine and a bag of chips is not going to solve this issue. No, it's not, but it can help regulate your system for a little bit, although a glass of wine and a bag of chips is probably not the best answer. A bubble bath. There you go. But those are the kinds of things. And so this is easier. These kinds of things to help yourself are easier to do when you're not in a full panic. So these are things that are better to do and ritualize, right, as part of your day. So have you been breathing? Do you have good food? What kind of rituals do you have in place? Exercise, sleep, self-soothing, mindfulness, self-compassion, those kinds of things can be really helpful. If you're curious about quick tips, it's always it's a good idea just to pay attention to your senses. I like to put together mental health first aid kits for some of my clients. And so what do they hear that makes them feel better? What can you smell that'll make you feel better? What can you feel, right? Weighted blankets, fuzzy things, those kind of things. And it can also help inoculate you when you're going into a stressful situation. So are you wearing a comfy clothes? Are you wearing your favorite sweater? Do you have something that looks appealing to you around, right? Those kind of things can be really quite helpful. And so self-regulation, that's what we're asking, is some of us, in terms of our mental health, over time, because of the amount of stress you're under, find that self-regulation can be more difficult, right? Over the course of a whole year, of course, we're struggling. Our regular coping skills become worn out. So and how do we deal with that? Well, you can't regulate yourself if you're dysregulated. So you can only regulate yourself outside of a fight, flight, or freeze response. So if you're in the middle of a fight or flight response, like, you can't regulate yourself. And I tell this because anyone who's ever had a fight with their spouse will know this. You're in the middle of an argument and it's just one more thing, right? It's just one more thing. It's like you can't stop yourself from saying more. And that's because if you're in the middle of that fight or flight response, you're not being rational in those moments, right? You cannot rationalize with an irrational person, including yourself. And there's that beautiful picture of my daughter again. And so what you want to do is make sure that if you're in that kind of state, you may not be able to do anything other than create safety, make yourself feel as calm as possible, and then talk about it later, right? Having an argument when you're in the middle of a fight or that dysregulated state isn't helpful. It's like two little babies crying at each other and they can't calm themselves down. But remember, what does a dysregulated system need? Is it needs a parent, it needs a caregiver, it needs a nurturer to come and help it calm down. So, yeah. Anyway, yeah, you can't rationalize with an irrational person, including yourself. So yeah, trying to doesn't make any sense. And so taking a break, riding that wave is more important. Okay. So what other things do we need to know? Well, trauma at its core is about disconnection. Healing, therefore, can only happen through connection. And so if you're struggling in terms of the work that you do, one of the best things you can do is look for connection, right? Look for other people who are going through similar things. And it's because this disconnect is always what trauma is about. It's about not feeling like you have enough resources. It's not feeling that you're supported enough. It's about feeling disconnected from the world and the work that you're doing. So finding the kind of way to heal that disconnection is going to be important. And that can be really difficult in the middle of this mess, right? So finding space to do that is super important. And we'll talk about boundaries in a minute, because that's where we're at. Okay, connection. So here's the trick for those of you who don't already know this, is that just like we were talking about the dogs in the chat room, is that the trick to any kind of helping professional is staying calm. You only need to be a little bit more calm than the people you're working with, right? And so if somebody's really aggravated, as long as you're a little less aggravated than them, they will follow you, right? In terms of that emotional space. So you can help calm a person down by just staying calm. People have a hard time staying angry or upset or emotional if you're in a calm state, right? The reverse is also true, though, is that dysregulation is contagious. So what happens is that if somebody's really activated around you, if their nervous system is really off balance, then you'll find that it's easy for you to follow them. And that's why helpers get so darn burnt out. It's because we spend our whole days trying to keep ourselves calm in the face of some of people who are struggling. And so our systems are constantly wanting to pull into this activated place because the people we work with are often very activated or underactivated, and we have to get more energy into them. And so we're constantly using our nervous systems as a way to help regulate the people around us. And it is exhausting. And so I don't know about you, but I have found at the end of the day, sometimes I just want to be alone because I don't want to have to read off other people's systems. Because I am a helper, empathy is something that I know I don't struggle with. How do we make it, or how can I make it safe for me? Yeah, it's exhausting. I agree. Okay, so it's a good tip. It's a great strategy. It's a superpower if you ask me, but it can be draining if you're constantly doing it. So what does that mean? Well, if you're having an emotional space, then ride that wave. Fighting it only makes it last longer. Judgment only makes people feel less safe. And self-compassion is really the key. I loved, my son and I were at the wave pool at West Edmonton Mall one day, and we were having a great conversation. This was a couple of years ago, about when he tried to dive into the wave, how it made it more difficult for him to get up for air. And then he would talk about how if he just sort of floated with the wave, it actually went better. And then he looked at me. You can tell my son is son of a social worker, because he's like, that's kind of like my emotions, Mom. I'm like, oh, I'm so proud. I'm so proud. Okay. My daughter's in the corner over there making lunch, so hopefully she's not too loud. Okay. No. So self-compassion is really the key. And one of the things that we often do is, like I said earlier, is we should on ourselves a lot. And so, and that isn't really helpful. I'll tell you why, because you know how we have that amygdala response, is that it turns out our amygdala is dumb and it doesn't know where danger is coming from. It just knows that it's in danger. And so what happens is that we have our amygdala, it goes to our hippocampus, which is our memory center. They have a little bit of a conversation about what we're going to do. Our prefrontal cortex eventually comes online. And sometimes what our prefrontal cortex does is has this internal dialogue about being a jerk, right? Why am I so stupid that even this is upsetting me? Why can I not handle it? I'm supposed to be a helper, for crying out loud. Why am I the one who needs help? Right? And so what ends up happening is our brain doesn't really recognize that voice as internal, as it sees it as another threat. And so then our amygdala has another stress response, drops more adrenaline and cortisol into our system, and then you end up in this spiral of conversation. So how do we do that? Well, if no one's around to pick you up and cuddle you like you did when you were a baby, nobody's doing that for your nervous system, then we have to find a way to do it for our own nervous system. So what that means is stop being so mean to yourself. Self-compassion is really a difficult thing to do, but it's something that we really need to try. Only when you can accept yourself that you are enough, that you are doing what you can and what you're capable of, just the way you are, will long-term sustainable change be possible. So self-compassion is the alignment of emotional and intellectual selves. What that really is our heart and our head being in line, being our emotions and our physiology, our body, being connected to each other. So if you feel physically exhausted, that is your mind telling, or that's your body telling your mind that you need to do something different. And so only can self-compassion happen when those two things are aligned and listening to each other. There's this little cartoon, it's called Heart and Head. I don't know if any of you have seen it before. I wish I could tell you the name of the comic, but he does this really great job of having this brain and this heart, and they have arguments all the time. Yeah, it's through the Awkward Yeti, if you want to look them up. I have the books all over my office, usually in my waiting room, not during COVID times, sadly, but it talks about that disconnect. And that's really when trauma is when parts of ourselves are not talking to each other. So our emotional and our intellectual selves are kind of shut off, right? Because this part of your brain isn't working when you're under too much stress. Okay, so back to this, grounding, right? So what did I say earlier about self-care? Is the same slide, right? How do we ground ourselves? You can do this as a ritual, but it's also about something that you can do in an immediate situation. So generally, how do we help ourselves? Well, set yourself up by making having nice smells around you, having things that you can feel good about, making sure that you're taking care of your body and eating things that taste yummy, things that are visually appealing, uh, hearing things. That's why nature can be so helpful, because it helps with all of those different senses that we have. But grounding can also be used in the immediate. If you're in an emotional, oh, thank you for putting the awkward Yeti in the chat. That's awesome, Kirsten. The grounding, if you're in the immediate situation, if you're trying to help somebody who's dysregulated, that you can really focus on these particular things and be helpful to, right? Sit down and just have somebody breathe with you can be very helpful. All right. Okay. If you're still looking for different kinds of suggestions, oh, hold on, I went too far ahead. Is tips that can work is what worked for you as a kid. So when we talk about self-soothing, what we can really go back to things that we did for ourselves to help ourselves calm, or that other people did for us. I'll give you an example. One of the things I recognized about my son is that he's a very tactile kind of kid, and so he used to play with my scarves when he was little, and he would just do this. And if when he would go to sleep when he was a baby, he would just take his blankie and kind of rub it until he would go to sleep. And that was his ritual every time. And so as he gets older, he's almost 13 now. He has like a weighted blanket. He has like more grown-up versions of the same thing, because for him, his sense of touch is super important in terms of self-soothing. And so think about it for yourself, and how can you use whatever it is. Some people really love music. Some people really like smells, right? My tea is part of my thing. And so find things that help you feel more soothed, and then do that. If you don't know what soothes yourself, if you haven't figured that out as you grow, then think about what other people did for you when you were young. For me, my dad used to give me a back rub, right? And so that to me can be really helpful if I'm feeling out of whack. Relaxing music, yeah, absolutely. Okay, what other things can we do? Oh, and so knowing that the adrenaline and cortisol is a biological reaction, there's a huge myth out there in the world that our mind and body are different things. Our mind and body are exactly the same thing, right? They interwork with each other all the time. And so we have to keep in mind when people are having a stress response, often they go to the doctor because they think there's something wrong with you or wrong with them. And really, it's just a biological response to stress. So if you think about adrenaline and cortisol in your system on low levels for over a year, and sometimes at higher levels for over years, there's going to be a biological implication for that. And so what do we need to do? Well, if we're in an immediate situation, of course, movement, right? So when I work with teenagers and they're having panic, I often encourage them to go outside, go for a walk, run up and down the stairs, because that'll get the blood through their system faster, so that adrenaline and cortisol can actually get metabolized by their liver and kidneys quicker, right? So you want people to move if they can. Exercise can help get those, there you go. I just spoke to my own slide. Breathing, of course, getting oxygen in your system can be really helpful. Gives muscles and other systems oxygen in order to help manage that hormone dump. We talk about comfort, right? Certainly a lot of people exercise can be helpful, or physical touch can be important. And those can counteract negative stress hormones with more positive ones. Short-term, food, water, sleep, right? So you'd be surprised how many times I go into counseling sessions and my response to people is to write on a little prescription pad, because I like to pretend that I know exactly what I'm talking about all the time, but how often I just tell people to drink more water, right? And it's not that it's a magic cure. It is definitely not, but it is something that somebody can do when they're feeling out of control. If you can get them to take at least one step in the right direction, then they can often feel more, right? Also pay attention to what you're drinking, right? One of the things I realized, I had a client the other day who was super huge, high anxiety, and we were constantly trying to figure out why her anxiety responses were so high. And then I realized that every time she came into my session, she had like a Monster, those Monster drinks, right? And how much caffeine was in there. And she drank 6 or 7 of those things a day. And of course she had so much anxiety. So what we did is just talked about, okay, how can we replace that, right? So not to get rid of the addiction to Monster drinks altogether, but how do we decrease it so that her physiological response isn't creating an emotional reaction. Okay, food, water, sleep. Those are the short-term things. Regular schedule for more long-term things. How do you have a regular schedule? Develop rituals, right? And generalize self-care. This is an interesting one for me because for those of us that work at home, rituals and having that boundary between home and work is really complicated when you're working from home because that bleed into each other happens a lot, right? So for instance, my kids making lunch right as we're talking, is that my work and my life tend to end up go together. And that's not necessarily a problem, but how do you find rituals to make sure that your workday, that somehow you signify to your body and your brain that this is work and now it's not, right? I always make a cup of tea before I start. Right? And then of course, general self-care, things that make you feel good about yourself. What I want you to be careful of is when we talk about biological responses, people seem to think that that means they have to use themselves as a project, right? If you're struggling, then all of a sudden you need to exercise more. I need to go to the gym more. I need to eat better. And then they make themselves this project. And that's really not a good setup for success. What I want to see in most people, or what I think is the most helpful, is small changes over time. Right. And so they don't need to go work out and lose 20 or 60 pounds. What they need to do is actually get up and go for a walk. And if we make the goals too big, then people are often not going to do them. And so keep that in mind for yourself too, is that it doesn't have to be big issues. It can be just going to the mailbox and taking a break for yourself to get the mail. And that those things, every little step is better than a big step, because otherwise you're just going to shit on yourself some more, right? It didn't work, so I can't even do this right. And we want to stop that negative self-talk because that's not helpful. We're getting to the end of the slides for those of you who are running out of steam, but we're just going to keep barreling through a little bit. And then the idea is, okay, so if you can do that, what we also need to start doing is look at boundaries, right? You are helping professionals. We are all struggling with the amount of work that we have to do. So how can we say when enough is enough, right? When can you say, no, I can't do this anymore? So without boundaries, empathy becomes a threat to your system. And it's because you can't give what you don't have. And so you have to be able to have empathy for yourself in order to be able to have empathy for others. Learning to say no without guilt or shame. And I wish that this slide made it easy, but I certainly struggle with this pretty regularly, especially when it comes to things like helping care for my mom, right? Having to say no to her can be difficult, but I have to in order for me to be able to function. Because if I just gave in to everybody in my life that wanted something for me, then there would be nothing of myself left. And I want my work to feel exciting and empowering. And if I don't have boundaries, it'll take over. Own your own feelings and do not take responsibility to feelings that aren't yours. And so this can be really difficult when you're talking about your kids, because often we take on their feelings, or your family, but it's also important for you to do this with the people you work with too. So respecting others' self-determination. And so sometimes people are not going to do what we want them to do, right? Sometimes people have the ability to make other kinds of decisions. I'm going to respect my daughter's need to eat chicken fingers right now. Prioritizing your needs and then listening to your body, right? You have to pay attention to the things that you need. And because you cannot take good care of other people if you're starting to explain, or if you're starting to have issues with yourself. Okay, you almost done? I feel like I should get you guys to say hi to her. She's over here and now she's hiding. She's got purple hair. It's very exciting. Yeah, okay, and it's also pink. All right. Oh, sorry. What we got here is developing boundaries. What I want you to do is start paying attention around things like being authentic, being, just give me 1 second. Are you gonna go? Just do it.
Okay. I was trying not to be too. I'm making food for Jonah too.
Yeah, I know. Go quick. Thank you. All right, you done? Thank you. Okay, so okay, when we're developing boundaries, one of the things you want to do is be authentic, right? Be honest with yourself, be honest with others, be yourself. And then, of course, again, listen to your body. Some of the ideas about having good boundaries is ritualizing non-negotiables. And so there are things in our lives that are really important for us to pay attention to, right? Developing routines, because routines make it easier for you to continue. So if you want to go for a walk every day, and try to make those kinds of things just things that are part of your day. So for instance, my tea is definitely something that I make sure I find time for every morning before I start work. Make time for the basics, right? So if you know you need to exercise, make sure you're building that into your day every day, and don't use it, because so often our self-care time is the thing that we'll get rid of first, right? Oh, I don't have time to do that today. So you have to build it into your day if it's something that you need, right? So figure out what your non-negotiables are and then make room for them. Build in downtime. And so if I'm telling you that your systems are really activated because of the nature of the work we do, because of that, like I was talking about, that contagion, right? In terms of anxiety, wanting to pull your nervous system in one direction or another, you need to know that building that activation, using your own nervous system to help calm people down, you're going to need time to relax and not have to read off other people's nervous system. So building in downtime is really important, and it's critical, right? Don't let people guilt you out of it. Check in with yourself. How are you doing? How are you feeling? What is your physiology telling you? Because most of us, our bodies will tell us when we're stressed long before our brains will even know it. Make space. So saying no usually means saying yes for something else. Make space for your life, right? You need to also have a life and not just work all day. It can feel like, this is temporary, but as we're going more long-term, we have to keep making space for living too, right? So making adjustments in terms of what you need. Protect your limited resources for the things and the people that matter. And so that's a difficult one, in that I think a lot of helpers, families are struggling because there's such a high need out there for people. We have to be really careful about not taking away from the people that we care about the most. Right. And so sometimes when I was saying earlier that, being on a Zoom for hours and then having somebody in my life want to Zoom with me later can be difficult. I have to try to find time for those people in ways that I can relate to them, because the people that matter in my life, my friends and family, it's important to also prioritize them too. And then, of course, connection. Have a person. I love this. Have a person professionally and personally. So in your personal life, who do you check in to? But certainly also do this in your professional life. Are we checking in with each other? Is there a person in your life that you can trust? I'll give you an example. Quite a few years ago when my dad was dying, one of the things that I did is I actually had my clinical supervisor. I checked within her every week, and I did so because I wanted to make sure I wasn't doing a disservice to the people I worked with, right? And so I wanted to make sure I was okay, and I trusted her to tell me that. And so if you've got stuff going on, making sure that you have that somebody in your work life that you can check in with too. And it doesn't have to be a supervisor. It could be a coworker. And I know some of you work in rural environments, so you may not have a colleague that's close by, but making sure you're building relationships that are professional so that you don't feel like you're in this all by yourself. And have a plan for reaching out when things are problematic, right? And spend time in nature. Okay, let's keep going. I just wanted to remind you of this slide. What else works? Things that help you make sense. Finding benefit. And so that's the part of gratitude, right? Looking for the things that are going well, not just focusing on all the negativity, but also finding places, right? We often talk about look for the helpers in the times of crisis. So looking actively for stories that make us feel good and positive is also important, because in the darkest times, there's also the brightest points of light. And so look for those too. And those of us working in these helping professionals, you know that there's like amazing things that are happening out there too. There's amazing stories. And so I want you to give those equal weight. And then know that you've changed in this, and notice the ways that you've changed, and how do you support that to be as positive as possible. Also, as we talked earlier about, is looking at those belief systems of yours and finding ways to support healthy adjustments rather than more negative ones. And then I just ending on this quote, in some ways, suffering ceased to be suffering in the moments we find meaning, such as the meaning of sacrifice. And so this to me is such an important quote. I love Viktor Frankl. If you've ever read, if you haven't read his book, it's called Man's Search for Meaning. It's he wrote it just after World War II, but it's probably the most influential text in my life. And it's short and it's really quite good. And he talks about looking for meaning in different places. So I know I didn't leave much time for questions, but I'm certainly willing to do that. I do have at the end of the slide some references for some of that, those statistics I gave. And so, and then here's the CMH, or CAMH, sorry, has some information on mental health in that, and I will share that slide and later, and Lola can send it out to everybody. All right, that was it. How are you all doing? Don't let me go in an anxiety spiral. Somebody has to come rescue me. Any questions?
Lots of accolades in the chat.
Yeah, I see that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, if there's no questions, that's great. I have my contact information on the slides, and like I said, I'll send them to Lola and she can send them out to you, and then you can always email me those questions later if you don't. But yeah, obviously anyone can leave whenever they want now.
Except for I got just one little thing. Well, actually 2 questions before you guys leave. So I just wanted to say, like, thank you so much, Krista, for that. I definitely am coming away with some tips and some tools that are going to help me cope better as a helper for sure. I'm going to stop shouldering on myself, or not shouldering, stop shooting on myself. I'm trying to be so careful about saying that, but I love that. Stop shooting on myself. I'm going to make sure and check in with my coworkers on a more regular basis. Make sure that I'm practicing self-compassion and have empathy for myself. So I hope everybody else walked away with some of those tips as well. So I just want to do just 2 really quick questions, and I hope that I still have some people on here. I have still quite a few. So I need to do an evaluation question, and in the past I've sent out emails afterwards, and that's just a pain for everybody. So what I would like to do is just ask you one question, and if you could just respond with even if you just raise your hand on your screen there, or if you raise your hand just like this, or if you say yes or no in the chat box. As a result of attending this workshop, do you feel better able to cope with your own stress during COVID as a helper? Lots of yeses.
Well, that's nice.
Yes, isn't that good to know? And it's Friday afternoon and it's a beautiful day and we're all walking away feeling better.
Yeah, so go outside.
Yes, exactly. Okay, and my second question is, this is workshop 4, I want to say. Does anybody have any suggestions for the next workshop? If you want to email me, if you want to just put it in the chat or whatever, I'll probably do another workshop in like a month and a half or so. So if there's anything in particular that folks want to learn more about, then I'm all ears.
Well, thank you all so much too. This was really fun. Yeah, it's always great to see that there's people out there caring and doing good work. So keep it up. We're gonna make it.
We are gonna make it. I'm pretty sure we're gonna make it. Okay, I'm not seeing lots of suggestions yet, but just like I said, make sure and email me your thoughts so I know what to plan for next.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody. Thanks, Krista.